How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of the Limit Breakers podcast. We have finally entered the double digits today, and we are doing so with an episode that I think is going to be particularly fun to record. Today, we are discussing the Metal Gear series as a whole, and breaking down a little bit about its history, and what makes it so crazy, exciting, innovative, and unique. Welcome one and welcome all to episode 10 of the Limit Breakers podcast. Welcome back, one. Welcome back, all, to the Limit Breakers podcast. We are off to a good start here. It's the weekend. It's Friday night. We're here with a little bit of scotch, some Metal Gear notes in front of us, and joined with some good buddies of mine. So it's off to a good start already. I am joined, as I usually am, by one of my co-hosts, Justin. What's going on, Justin?
Not too much. How's everything going?
You know, it's been, as we discussed our last episode, it's been sort of, hectic in the Limit Breakers world, but it's kind of nice just to get back to an episode where we're actually discussing game content and not doing any of the housekeeping or discussing departed members or anything else like that. So I'm glad just to get back to, some degree of normalcy. How about you?
I think we got a solid episode lined up, if you will.
I'll forgive you that one pun, but if a couple more come out, there's going to be some issues.
Noted.
Yeah, what's going on, guys? As you heard in the intro, this is a Metal Gear episode. It's primarily going to be a Metal Gear Solid episode, but we are going to touch on the Metal Gear genre at large. As we like to do, we like to start off talking about what we've been playing recently and what's been going on in our world. But we are joined also today by a guest who has not been on the show previously. He's a very good buddy of ours and actually pretty intricately tied to the history of Metal Gear and Metal Gear Solid in my mind. So without further ado, what's going on, Jeff? How are you?
What's going on, guys?
We are very glad to have Jeff. As I mentioned with Andrew on the episodes he was on, it's kind of hard for me in my mind to sort of separate some of the people that I share these memories of these games with. They're so important to me when I think about them that it's just almost essential to me to have these people around to bounce the ideas off of and relive some of the memories with, because they're just so intricately tied to them. So I hope you're pretty excited, Jeff. I'm very excited to have you here, and I think many of the things we're going to talk about today are things that we've discussed in our own time anyway. So it's going to be some old conversations, hopefully some new ones, but for the most part, I'm very excited. Thanks for being on.
Absolutely.
Is the scotch putting you in a Metal Gear type mood, or?
Always.
That's good
Happens
to hear.
Every time.
Good to hear. Well, yeah, like I mentioned, let's get started just talking, I guess, about what we've been playing or what we've been doing. As I mentioned last time, I was in the middle of playing Breath of Fire 3, which Andrew always gave us a lot of grief for playing. But I'm sort of stuck in that weird rut again of an increasing number of things that I want to get to playing, but actually have not yet. So Breath of Fire is sort of in my system right now, but I jotted down a couple other things that are sort of on the docket for me. Twilight Princess HD, which came out a while ago, which I had not gotten to. Fire Emblem Fates Birthright, which I have not gotten to. Majora's Mask 3DS, the list goes on. But those are all sort of in the queue. Breath of Fire has been what I've been playing in the meantime, but also doing some stuff that I know we all want to talk about that's in the gaming realm, but not specifically gaming. So before I get into, I think, something that'll be a nice little group chat, anything you've been playing or anything of note to mention, Justin?
Well, I finally put in the Metal Gear Solid disc that I was talking about earlier this week, and haven't gotten too far, just to the first save point, but just already starting to get in the mood, and cinematics have already got me, just all giddy, just seeing what's going to happen. Nothing like a good stealth game to get me in the zone, if you will.
Yeah, I know we talked a little bit about just how, the perspective I think is going to be really helpful, because there's like this sort of, as you'll find out over the course of the episode, Jeff and I are both Metal Gear veterans in the sense that we've played a lot of the games and really are longtime fans. And Justin's just sort of, he's always been around the games through us, but just sort of getting into playing them himself. So it's going to be really cool to kind of see the difference in perspective from someone who's brand new, bringing fresh eyes to the series, and people that have been fans for a long time. So I know we talked about, would it be an issue that you haven't played quite as much Metal Gear, but I actually think it's going to be nice because you can kind of have a very different perspective on it. I know Jeff isn't the most, as is the case with a lot of people these days, the most active gamer currently, but is there anything, sort of in the greater spectrum of even game-related stuff that's sort of caught your attention recently, or are you more just been Metal Gear on the brain, or anything whatever you want to bring up.
I actually just saw. I saw the poster for a game. I think it comes out next year called For Honor. I actually just ended up watching. I think it's about a 10-minute long mission. It's a single mission playthrough, and it's commentated by one of the developers of the game. And from what it seems like it's going to be insanely cool. Really, really, really cool.
That's one of those that got like a ton of buzz. I can't remember if the first announcement or the first trailer was at E3, but I know that was like a really, really big and really talked about game. I haven't actually watched. I've seen that trailer posted. I haven't watched it, but I know a lot of people that were going like ape about it. So I know that's a big one. So I mean, I think it's cool that maybe this is a good question to ask. Do you feel like gaming media and trailers and sort of promotional stuff is sort of more present and more available now with sort of social media and stuff, or the same as it always was? I feel like there's more people have more exposure to stuff like that. I'm guessing you didn't have to like seek that out on some crazy niche site. It was probably like on YouTube or social media or something, right?
Yeah, I'm assuming it was probably just right on Facebook somewhere. I just saw the actual poster is literally just a giant medieval knight, a giant Viking barbarian, and a giant samurai soldier that are just pretty much just hanging out. And so right off the bat, I was like, that looks awesome.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially a breakdown of exactly what, I mean, that's 3 bullet points you can't really go wrong with, I feel like. So, yeah, that game's gotten a lot of hype. I'm actually pretty pumped for that. But the thing I wanted to bring up before we got into sort of the nitty-gritty of Metal Gear and some of the other stuff is actually something that I kind of fanboyed out about on our last episode, which is the TV show Stranger Things. And I talked about it not only because I enjoy it so much, but also because it was really cool to see the creators of that show acknowledge how the influence of games sort of really played an actual significant role on them developing the show. One that was cool because, as I'll ask you, Jeff, I think that those influences were actually pretty, not even if they weren't obvious, like once they mentioned them, I could clearly see where the influences came from. And 2, it was just cool to know that we've sort of entered an age where it's not taboo to say, I was inspired by video game stuff. There was probably a time when that would have been a very weird thing to say in regard to like a mainstream major, media or television show. But like nowadays, it's sort of become acceptable and non-ridiculous to admit that. So would you say you saw the influence of things like Silent Hill and The Last of Us and those types of games in Stranger Things at all?
Absolutely. Obviously, the content was there as far as the sci-fi stuff, but in general, actually, to connect the two, I got a lot of that Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid linear style with a lot of how it was shot. Obviously, the entire world is out there, but there was really, really, really cool scenes where you can just see the actor progressing. And as they moved, it was almost like a video game.
Yeah, no, I think the way the story was told and it was shot absolutely reflected that. I think it's that very, like, really creates a strong sense of atmosphere when you had a lot of those shots where it's like, not only is the visual design similar, Justin, I've been trying to con into watching this, and I'm sure he will at some point, but this isn't so much.
If somebody wants to pay for my Netflix subscription, that'd be lovely.
There you go.
Well, I watched the entire thing in Cam's basement, so.
Yeah, no excuses.
Do what you got to do.
Play like a champion. But, no, I absolutely agree. Not only was the visual design of the show, especially later on, so reminiscent of those games, but also just the way that people moved through the actual settings was laid out very much so like those games progress, with that sense of tension and all that stuff. So I just thought it was a cool sort of side note. I know Jeff and I have enjoyed that show, and the fact that it sort of ties in to video games in terms of its development, which is really cool to me. The last thing I want to mention before we get into the Metal Gear portion of it is that towards the end, we are going to discuss a little bit of our upcoming Dungeons and Dragons campaign / adventure / first time go round. I don't know if you guys are excited, apprehensive, completely ambivalent about it, but I'm actually pretty excited, and I think now would be a cool time just to discuss sort of very quickly and in passing about that. But we can save that to the end to sort of keep it distinct from Metal Gear. So without further ado, do you want to get into the main portion of this thing?
Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, as we usually try to do, we're going to kind of quickly go over the brief history of the series itself, just to sort of set up what it is for maybe people that haven't played it before. We're not really a history show, we're like a fact-finding show, so this is going to be a really brief history, but it'll just give you a sense of kind of where we're coming from. But the Metal Gear series, I guess as a whole, began in 1987 with the original game Metal Gear, which was actually initially released for what was called the MSX, which was, I think, a Microsoft like computer system, which is kind of interesting to me because I knew like it was ported to the NES, and the first time I was aware of it existing was as an NES game, but originally it was for an actual like home computer system that was specifically a Microsoft thing. That progressed up to Metal Gear 2, which came out in 1990 for the MSX2 and was eventually ported over here years later. But this series began quite a long time ago, back in the 80s, and it was designed by a guy named Hideo Kojima. It was actually a first-time game designer who made Metal Gear as his first project on his own. Now, I think where we became familiar with it as a group was actually in Metal Gear Solid, which was released in 1998 for the PS1. And the series has kind of, become so large and expansive over the course of the following years that it's not probably worth mentioning every single iteration of it. But at this point, I think it comprises 22 games that span all the way back from that 87 entry all the way up through the PS4 and multi-console release of The Phantom Pain, which is a pretty recent game as of 2015. So we're talking about a series that spans 22 games over 28 years from, really early video gaming to cutting-edge gaming now. A ton of games, a ton of spin-offs, a main series, handheld games, just a very large series, and a series with obviously a lot of history to it. So I want to talk about our own history, but I think that just gives you a sense of, we're talking about a pretty broad topic here. It's not looking at one specific game and really having the ability to go into a ton of detail about that, because this is a really long series. This is a series with a lot of history, a lot going on. I think we'll focus on specific things, but obviously, that's pretty broad. So, Justin, why don't you start? Because we have our own history, but you can just kind of establish, before we talk about our own sort of personal fond or not so fond memories of playing Metal Gear, do you have sort of a vague recollection of like us mentioning it back then or anything like that? Or
Yeah, I was gonna say let's take a trip back through time here, if you will, and let's take it back to 1998, and I think we were all in middle school at that point, and for me, the first mentioning of it, first seeing it by you guys, I hadn't really seen anything like it. I feel like games like SOCOM and Call of Duty, those types of games, kind of took the concept of Metal Gear Solid a few years later and kind of made it a more multiplayer format, took that kind of stealth single player campaign mode and just kind of emulated that and migrated it over. So really kind of, I feel like it's obviously like a landmark series for video games, and a lot of copycats, and I feel like just playing it, I mean, from what I've seen, just the use of cinematics and the voiceover just kind of added, it was kind of the first of its kind to do that, along with Final Fantasy, but even Final Fantasy didn't have voiceover at that point. So yeah, it was really impressive to see at the time, and just watching the series develop and seeing how it's expanded into the franchise that it is today. I was very impressed to see that.
Yeah, because it was sort of one of those things where I feel like at that younger age, Metal Gear Solid having come out when we were all, I think, either 10 or 11, it was almost like a community event when you bought games. Justin and I grew up in close proximity. We became friends with Jeff soon after. But I don't know if you had a similar experience, Jeff. Back then, it was sort of like when one person in a small group or like a neighborhood got a game, it was almost a communal event in the sense that like I was aware of stuff you guys were playing, even if I wasn't playing it, because it was like money was tighter and you might only get one game every now and then. So you were like all aware of something that was going on, even if you yourself weren't playing it. So I didn't know if you remember, Justin, like when we all got it, but I remember us talking about it back then and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So Jeff, do you have specific memories of your first entry into the Metal Gear world?
I do. The first thing that caught my attention was growing up both in my neighborhood and also here. It's pretty much everybody else's house was kind of the hangout spot, where everybody would congregate, play the Mario Karts, the group games. At home, I never even owned a second controller that I can remember. I never had a sibling that played in my spot. My house was never the place where people would come hang out. So Metal Gear, right off the bat, just having that single player story mode was something that I needed, since I didn't have even a second player to start with. So yeah, actually there was a couple of older kids in my neighborhood who put me onto it. And I, ironically, of course, despite the fact that it's a single-player game that I struggled for obviously hours and hours and hours by myself, the first time that I beat it was at one of my friend's house with 2 other friends when we actually got through it completely.
Yeah, it was a really similar experience for me, and I think Jeff and I became friends either 99 or 2000-ish, so like it would have been not long after the release of this game that we kind of met, and I'm not sure if it was like something I know it was brought up and we kind of bonded over it to a certain extent pretty quickly. I can't remember if it was, right away or not, but this would have been like around that same time period. But I remember actually having a really similar experience where I can distinctly remember going to Blockbuster trying to get something else. And I can't remember what it was at the time, but I can remember going and being super disappointed that whatever game I wanted to rent wasn't there. And then there was like an entire side display where, there'd be like the aisles, and at the end of the aisle, they'd have like a separate sort of display set up for like something that was brand new or like heavily promoted. And it was just a whole thing of Metal Gear Solid, and there was like 1 or 2 copies left. And I don't even know what it was about the display that even caught my eye because, action sort of military-esque like games of that vibe never really stood out to me. But for some reason, I think I had maybe seen like an ad for it in the PSM magazine or something. So I was pissed off that whatever game I wanted wasn't there, but I got that just on a lark. And very similar to you, I remember, I don't think I played a single moment of that game the first time through by myself. I think every time I played it was this girl, our mutual friend Brittany back in the day, but it was like such an eye-opening experience to play the game because I was so unprepared for what it was, but also because I think the presentation and story, as we'll talk about later, were just so captivating and just so different than what I had played previously that even people that weren't actually playing at the time, like we'd pass the controller around, whoever wasn't playing almost felt like they were still watching a movie or like really playing along with you because, the cutscenes and the style of game just made you feel so involved. So it wasn't like sitting there and watching someone run through like a Mario level where you're kind of just like watching how they actually navigate the level. This was almost like popping popcorn and like watching a film while someone else played. So I had a very similar experience. It was definitely amongst the most fun games to just sit back and watch someone else play.
To that point, I still to this day and have always despised watching other people play video games. I struggle to sit through TV shows. I struggle to sit through movies. So especially with a video game, when not only am I already struggling to sit through it, but now I have somebody else getting all the enjoyment and all the action, I usually struggle with. But this was still one of the only games, and definitely the first one that I can recall, that it was, if not as fun, it was damn near close to still being as enthralling throughout, just watching someone else play.
I can attest to that in terms of Jeff's willingness or lack thereof to sit still for that type of stuff. And also, I think that attests very strongly to the type of game series that it is, that is true about this, because it's really tough for something to really kind of hold your attention when you're just sort of sitting watching someone else do something. But now I had the exact same experience. The one thing I left out of the actual history portion that I think is going to transition really well into the next thing I wanted to talk about is Kojima initially developed this game, or it was someone else's project that he actually came on to make the original Metal Gear. Someone else was already designing the game, and he was asked to step in when they stepped down. And the game was actually intended to be super action heavy, but because of the limitations of the console they were making it on, it wasn't really possible to do that much cool looking action back then, especially on that MSX platform. So he thought it'd be more interesting if it went more stealth based and more like escape based, because then it didn't rely on crazy looking guns and ammo and explosions, because you could only really do so much in 87. So I think that was sort of a creative decision that's sort of very emblematic of Kojima's style later, that ultimately really kind of shaped the entire series and really kind of changed the landscape of gaming in general. Because if this just would have been another generic like Contra type game, who knows if this series would even be close to what it is today. But it was a really cool thing to sort of, I think he said he based the actual idea of the game off like a well-known World War II like war story about an escape from a German prison, which is a very specific thing to use as a point of reference for a game, but this goes to show you how his mind was working in developing this thing. So with that said, why don't we talk a little bit about Kojima himself, because I think I'm struggling to think of another instance of a game series or even like any piece of media anywhere that is quite as inextricably tied to its creator as Metal Gear. Like, it's the type of thing where I feel like you really can't talk about one without talking a lot about the other, because his name is so synonymous with the series. Everything about what makes him a designer and a person is so evident in the series. So I wanted to pose the question, and I guess I can ask Justin this in one way and Jeff this in another way, and I think all the conversation will be really kind of interesting. But I wanted to pose the question of whether or not Kojima, who is sort of this renowned and infamous, designer, is he an auteur in the sense of, the way we'd use the term to describe film directors, etc., or is he just kind of, off his rocker? Because I think there's lots of people that feel, either way about him. And Justin, I kind of want to pose the questions in regard to you, just kind of coming from a film perspective of like what really makes someone sort of a unique, distinct, creative director. And Jeff and I are going to, I think, approach it more from the standpoint of exact stuff from the Metal Gear series. But before we even get into the specifics of it, do you, in sort of being a fan of the series, did you ever really have like a strong opinion about him himself, or did you kind of just see him as, oh, he's the guy that made these games?
I've always, just like you were saying, I've always associated one with the other. I think right off the bat, it showed a lot about him, both creative-wise and also just personality-wise, when he went against the grain completely right out of the gate. And like you were saying, took that game from basically Contra and made it into what we have 30 years later, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so... I think it's one of my favorite things about, this is going to sound broad, but like one of my favorite things just about art and about media is just seeing how much someone's personality shines through in what they make. And I feel like in games, a lot of times, you don't really feel like you're really seeing anything too unique or that much of someone's personality really poked through in such a crazy way like you do in, independent film or like music or things like that. But this is a case where I really feel like his influences and his personality are so evident in the game that you really feel like you're getting something that is the complete baby of the person making it, and not some just crazy corporate production that's like, let's take elements from every popular game and, repackage it. This is like clearly from one person's mind that wanted things a very specific way. And, it just like super cool to see that. So would you say that any words come to mind or specific things come to mind if you were asked to describe sort of what makes Kojima to you? Like what is he synonymous with in your opinion? Or do you want me to kind of suggest a couple of things I think?
For me, like I was saying initially, you think renegade, you think innovator, you think really anyone who is gonna sit across from his boss at this huge Japanese game firm and say, your idea sucks, this is my idea. They're gonna push back and say, we don't like it, and he's gonna say, too bad.
Yeah, and I think that happened quite a bit. I think he actually had a couple or a bunch of projects turned down before he actually got put on this one. So he had learned, the pain of defeat and failure quite a lot. But I think one of the coolest things that is sort of an awesome talking point, I think, Justin, this is where you can weigh in pretty heavily, is I think one of the quotes by him that really sort of I like just as a quote, and I like even more because it's from him, was him talking about the way he approaches storytelling. And I thought it was really cool because I think, there's games that are story driven and there's games that are less about story and more about, just the experience of playing them. But I think Metal Gear has always kind of walked a fine line between engaging story and just damn cool and fun gameplay. And I think in doing that, he talked about how games usually fall into one of two categories. It's either one, that you're on a very kind of narrow pathway and rail where everything you do in the game is kind of almost like determined for you before you even start playing. There's a beginning, a middle, and end that have to go the way they have to go. And they're that way because they want you to feel a certain way. They want you to experience certain things. It's like a movie or TV show where, they've designed everything a certain way and they want you to feel a certain way. So they're going to put it on a platter for you. Then there's games that have multiple endings, multiple paths you can travel, different stuff you can do, where you really sort of, tell the story yourself and decide how you want to go about it and bring in open world gaming or whatever else you want to call it that has really sort of taken the world by storm. He said he doesn't really think that there's a right or wrong answer to storytelling, that it's not about, and we talked about this in our storytelling episode, but that it's not about one being better than the other, or one being, the real way and one being the fake way, that they both have a lot of merit, and that it's finding kind of a balance between those two things that is the most important. That, yes, while doing choice A allows you to control what the player's feeling, it sort of takes away that feeling of actually making an impact on the story yourself. But if you go entirely open world, it kind of takes away that actual feeling of like setting up specific things for the player and being excited to have them explore that. So I know we talked about it a little bit on our storytelling episode, but just from the standpoint of storytelling as a whole, and sort of from a director standpoint, do you kind of think that middle ground approach is sort of a good one to take in gaming, or is it sort of just neither here nor there?
I mean, I would say it's neither here nor there. I want to go back to an earlier point you were asking when you posed the question of, is he an auteur or is he insane? I would more go the auteur route. If you look at his childhood growing up, and he was very passionate about film and very much into like 8mm filmmaking and things like that, and then he kind of saw the video game industry as a chance to start again and pursue his actual passions. And I think seeing him, like, he was very loyal to himself, and he was also loyal to his fans. So he stuck to his passions. He found a way to take the Metal Gear series, and like you said, it started off on the MSX platform, and he migrated it to NES and then eventually Sony. And he was able to take it from this very basic concept, evolve it, and adapt his passion for like filmmaking and the cinematics, which is very much present in the Metal Gear series. And he basically adapted his hobbies and passions into this game, while still evolving the story and giving the fans the story that they wanted all along, and kind of separating from the pack, getting out of Konami and starting his own company. And I think that's very it says a lot about a person when you're able to do that. I mean, do I think he's partially insane to a certain extent? I think you have to be, with all the twists and crazy turns that I've heard about you guys talk about when he's talking about the Metal Gear series. I think all artists are, somewhat insane. I think that's what makes you creative. And I think he's definitely a pioneer, going from the 80s to late 90s and being one of the first to add all of these cinematics and graphics and voiceover to the game. I think it says a lot.
Were you aware, Jeff, from like the very get-go, kind of how much there was cinematic influences in the Metal Gear series, like all the references to obvious characters and movies and other things? Or because there were some for me that I got like right off the bat, and others that sort of I learned over time. But it's obvious looking back now how much his love of movies, and particular movies, really completely, he wasn't subtle about it. Like, they were pretty right in your face in the games.
Like, especially in particular, there's actually some really funny older art that you can look up from the games that are just actual direct recreations. Like, I know I believe it might have been Big Boss initially was literally just Sean Connery from The Hunt for Red October. Like, it was just his face put into a video game was the actual face that was used initially. But as far as specifics, not really. But in general, I've always just been a huge fan of that whole 80s action blow 'em up style. Still am. And so for me, that, like, right out of the gate was huge.
Yeah, the voice, name, and sort of character of Snake definitely struck me right away as a reference to the Escape Froms. I don't think he was meaning for that to be like overly, the voices and really appearance, especially with the longer hair, is like straight up, and the eye patch obviously is, at least on Big Boss, straight up like Kurt Russell, and you get up to Snake Eater and like the James Bond sort of homage get pretty on the nose. But for some reason there's never, we can talk a little bit about why those do or don't work in the games, but for me there's never, even though I think I realized some of them right off the bat were like clear references, they never took me out of the games. I never felt like, oh, well, he's just making reference to this thing, so that's that's not that cool. They somehow felt like they made sense and worked, and still felt somewhat unique, even though I knew like they were coming directly from somewhere else and really inspired by something else. But I know that even though we're primarily talking about the Metal Gear series and Kojima's work on it, he has done a lot of work on other stuff, and I just want to touch on briefly because I think it reveals a lot of his influences that come to play big time in the Metal Gear series later, but he did a game called Snatcher, which was actually for the PC and Sega CD primarily. I think it was re-released on some other consoles, but those were the first two, and it's expensive as hell to get now. I wish I owned a copy, but it's a couple $100. So at some point, maybe I'll pony up for it. I've never, I know some people use emulators and stuff, but that's a big one that I think from a very early point showed the clear influence of like film noir stuff on him. It's like a graphic novel type game where you sort of like the interface is almost like you're almost flipping through like a choose your own adventure type book where you're investigating rooms and stuff. But that was like a straight up, Akira, Blade Runner type game. He did a series called Zone of the Enders that was for PS2, I think, that was like really influenced by like the anime robot stuff, which is obviously like I think it's Neon Genesis Evangelion. That's like a pretty heavy influence on that. He had a creative consultation role on Castlevania Lords of Shadow, which I actually really like, which is a series that was never known for its like narrative, and then Kojima gets involved and the narrative goes from I am a person killing vampires to like this incredibly epic, incredibly insane thing, and like it's so obvious how much he influenced the development of that game. And then finally we can talk, I guess, at the end about the trailer for I don't know if you've seen the trailer for Death Stranding. I know Jeff and I were talking about that, but that trailer, like, I think kind of sums up his entire style and his entire vibe in like a nutshell so well that it's just a perfect encapsulation of who he is as a creative person. But as we kind of like to do the most here, I want to spend the majority of the time just talking about what we like most about the series, what makes the series so unique to us, some of our favorite memories, moments. And I think there's so many. And then in Justin's case, you can kind of, some of these will be if you have a sincere desire to play them all, spoilery, but at the same time, I think some are so involved you wouldn't even really know what the references mean. You could talk about names that might not mean a whole lot to you, but that you've heard. I think the name Big Boss. You might not know anything about who he is, but if we said Big Boss, you'd say, "Oh, yeah, I've heard you mention that." So I think there's so many to do. You want to kind of just like go back and forth and just mention some and just kind of wax poetic about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Start them up.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this was so hard for me to do because I feel like anytime you're talking about a series this expansive, it's tough to sort of, well, really, anytime you're talking about favorite or least favorite anything, it's kind of tough for me. I'm not good at doing that, but I do feel like a series like this where there's just so much love to be spread around that even though it's really tough to do, I think kind of breaking down the main series from favorite to least favorite, I think we owe the listener. So I want to preface this by saying I love all the games in the series. I've played and beaten all the numbered entries. I've beaten Metal Gear Solid through the Phantom Pain. I've played a lot of the spin-offs, but I have not played all the games by any stretch. There's, like I mentioned, 22. A lot of them are like for obscure consoles and just tough to find. So I think you've beaten up through Snake Eater and then seen some of 4 and 5.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, we're on similar ground as far as that goes. But yeah, I guess I guess I'll ask what your preferences are for the first 3, and then I'll include 1 through 5.
Well, first things first, VR Missions is by far my favorite. I actually did end up getting that separately. I think it was one of those weird things that in Japan it came out just as an extra disc with one of the versions. And then by the time it made its way to America, it was just an actual separate game that you had to buy.
Yeah, I remember that well.
Which I did have. But I think Metal Gear Solid has to be my favorite still, especially just with all the nostalgia and just where I was in my gaming life when I first played that. There was just so much innovation, so much going on that there's no way that can be beat. For me, it's still my favorite game of all time, period. So obviously, it's going to take the cake. Snake Eater, though, is a very close second for me. It's probably right in line. It's probably my second favorite game of all time. And then Sons of Liberty obviously comes in at third, but still probably in my top 5 favorite games in general. So yeah.
We're going to find some commonality then, because I also listed the original Metal Gear Solid as my first choice, and I also listed Sons of Liberty as my last choice, which this isn't a wide divide, I'll say, for me, and I think you put it obviously it's your opinion, but I think you put it well. This isn't like I loved this but hated this. For me, it's a spectrum of, on the grading scale, they're all A's, but they're different level A's for me. I put the original Metal Gear Solid first, then the Phantom Pain, then Snake Eater, then Guns of the Patriots, then Sons of Liberty. And they're not separated by that much, but I do feel like, gun to my head, that's the way I'd put them. And yeah, there's just something. Do you feel like for you that the sort of innovation and the emotional tie to the first game is what really sets it apart? Or do you feel that as a game experience, it's just better? Or is it kind of hard to just separate the two?
I think it's too hard for me to separate the two, which I think speaks to how unbelievably amazing it was done. I feel like anytime, especially a video game, has that sort of impact on really your life in general, how you look at video games for the rest of your life. It's been, like we were saying, 98 that game came out. So we're coming up on almost 20 years later.
Yeah, it's insane to think of that.
And I'm still sitting here saying that about it. So I think it's hard to separate, but in general, it also just speaks to what it did for me.
What do you think just of the brief bit you've seen, Justin? I mean, obviously, you're not judging it so much on the whole in any sense, but just like if you had to sum up, put it this way: if you think you would have played that upon release and that would have been the opening to the game, would that have been something that would have sort of interested you or captured you back then, or is it kind of just not your cup of tea, or somewhere in between?
I know I definitely would have been interested in it, and I am interested in it. Obviously, that's why I'm playing it. But just being interested in film, as much interested in film as I am, just right from the opening sequence. I mean, I feel like I'm just in like a throwback movie, and right away, that already gets my interest in. And I don't know, I feel like it's just for the time period and for what it was for PS1. I mean, like it's insane, like how good everything was about it. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, what's so cool to me is I think, because I'm exactly the same way, Jeff. Like, it's really, and it's annoying to me in general, like having to do with anything, but especially games and really games and movies. It's like, it's tough for me sometimes to really sort of try to, because when you're reviewing anything, you can't really be completely objective. It's tough. I mean, you're always going to be somewhat influenced by your own likes or dislikes, your own tastes. But when I'm trying to rate things like this, especially this long after the fact, I do try to look back and think, if I'm looking at this just as an experience compared to these other experiences, removing the fact that it was like such a big part of my life at that moment, as a game specifically, is it really a better, tighter, more fun, or whatever else game than the other members of the series? And I think upon reviewing it, I really do think it holds up in that regard. Like, I think it's a perfect middle ground of the series where, some of the complaints about the games becoming increasingly complex and convoluted and nuts on one end, and then the other end becoming like I think it's a perfect balance of Kojima at with a story that's really wacky and bizarre and interesting, but still like somewhat possible to follow along without losing your mind, and it allows for enough freedom and like experimenting without being too open-ended. You could try, it's a relatively short game, but you could really play kind of how you wanted still to some extent and feel like you had some freedom. And I feel like the series past that point kind of teetered from one end to the other a lot. Like there was a lot of stuff that was really drastic in one way or the other. It was either like too little player influence and like too guided, or completely balls, I was going to say balls deep. That doesn't make any sense.
Balls out?
Yeah, completely balls deep in me at the time. But no, balls out, just absolutely nuts, like in terms of just giving you too much freedom and really just sort of being almost too insane to kind of, I guess bonkers was the word I was trying to think of. But yeah, like I feel like one is just that perfect middle ground of just weird and just like crazy enough, but still very comprehensible, and just enough freedom, but still very short and concise and just playable. So I think even taking my feelings out about it, because I really do have love for all of them, I do think it just, as an experience, is just kind of the perfect summation of what Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear as a whole are for me. Whereas I don't know if my opinions about the other games match up with yours, but I'd be interested to hear. I put the Phantom Pain second, and that's one actually we can talk a little bit more about that specifically, because that's enters into the whole question of, did Metal Gear as an open world game work? But Snake Eater, I know you mentioned you like a lot. See, Snake Eater for me, I think, might have been the coolest use of environment and atmosphere in the entire series. I personally didn't hate, but my least favorite villain in the Metal Gear series was in Snake Eater, being Volgin. So that probably had my least favorite story, but favorite like gameplay mechanics and atmosphere. I don't know if those were the things you also found yourself liking about it, but
in general, yeah, I definitely agree with the Volgin thing. And the story definitely nowhere near the gameplay. But I do know that especially going into that game, he made a huge push to get outdoors, which I thought was obviously another genius decision by Hideo to just get everything outside, completely new environment, new exposure to literally everything.
Oh, because I mean, it's completely insane when you look back at the first game, and really the first two games, but especially the first game where you spend really the entirety of the game either inside or like right outside of buildings through these corridors, and you really feel like you're in this very industrial, isolated sort of environment the whole time. Then you switch to this game that you're out in the complete middle of nowhere in these forests and mountains with crazy animals crawling all over you, and food falling, and the ambiance of birds and all kind of stuff. And it really, like, if you go from one to the other pretty quickly, it's so drastically insane how different the feeling is, and yet it still has that exact same Metal Gear quality, but it's so distinct in terms of everything else about the atmosphere itself that it almost like shouldn't work, but it worked so well for me. Like, there's just something about the survival element that it was complex, but it wasn't like over the top. It was just incredibly cool. Like, you shouldn't be able to make a change that drastic in a series and have it work that well, but that was the thing. I played Snake Eater after the fact. I remember you had played it before I had, and I kind of never bought into the hype to a certain extent, but after I played it, I mean, that element just worked so well. It was awesome.
I kind of want to talk about a little bit with Jeff, because his job kind of utilizes some of the aspects of the actual game, I feel like. How do you feel like it holds up almost 20 years later? How realistic do you think it is using some of the weapon skills and things like that, the survival elements that you may have learned in your current job?
Well, that I will discuss that a little bit coming up shortly. But in general, I think as a whole, a lot of the things, even that seemed weird or over the top, especially at the time, realistically probably weren't. And right now, especially, we were literally just passing with Cox. We were down and we were passing some building. It's a huge warehouse. It's called something robotics. And he asked me in passing if I had any clue what was in there. I have no idea why. I would know, but they have something in there. They have a warehouse full of robots, potentially. I don't know. There could literally be a Metal Gear in there for all we know. But in general, I think the realism is definitely way closer to real, I think, than you would honestly assume, especially if you were just kind of reading about it or playing through the game. If you actually stopped and think about how close to home it probably is, I think it's closer than you would think initially.
Do you think that that's probably like the most realistic video game you played during that time period, and maybe that's what piqued your interest towards it initially, especially when like other prevalent games during around 98, I guess, were like Pokemon and maybe Final Fantasy VII?
Yeah, and especially that's always been my interest. Like I was saying with the action movies, I'm really not a big sci-fi guy, don't really do much fantasy stuff. So having that real-life war combat type thing definitely got me hooked initially, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that was coolest about the stealth aspect to me and that felt the most different wasn't just the fact that you were sort of sneaking through in like a puzzle-solving manner, but it was just how vulnerable you felt. Like, that might have been unrealistic in the sense that, there was probably things that would kill you in real life that you can somehow survive in the game. But the feeling of like, holy shit, if these people see me, I might be in trouble, instead of, oh, I'll just pull out this crazy gun and like run towards people and start shooting. Like, you really felt like, let me make a smart decision here and do what makes the most sense here, rather than just, obviously Contra is not a good comparison, but, action games were really big at that time, and it was just actually really refreshing and really nice to feel that level of tension where, legitimately hiding in a box and waiting for people to pass by was like just as exciting as in another game shooting your way out of like a hallway, because it really felt like there was like things at stake, and you really felt like a guy alone in a military complex, not like some unstoppable action hero. Despite the fact that Solid Snake is pretty badass, but
I think, especially for me, and I think in general, this is by far, this game probably gave the highest amount of value on every single life that I've ever had in a game. I mean, of course, you have like that, the restart, the respawn. In most games, like Call of Duty right now, somebody might die literally 30 times in a 5-minute game. But especially in that, there were times where literally it felt like it was my life that I was about to lose if I died one random time halfway through the game.
And I feel like that type of investment is like it's what everyone aims for in any kind of media, like movies, TV, gaming, where that level of personal involvement and attachment and just, kind of connection with the player or viewer is like so hard to establish. And when you can do that in a game that's relatively short and relatively like, doesn't use very on the nose, obvious like means by which to get you hooked. It's really kind of like unique and creative in its approach. It's just a really strong recommendation of the game. I mean, I'm hoping you kind of feel the same when you play it, Justin, but
I remember actually, it's kind of funny because we're talking about this perfect point with the timeliness. So we are doing the podcast this weekend, and with it being 9/11 anniversary, 15th anniversary coming up, I remember watching the end of the second Metal Gear Solid with you, and I think that was like the first time I ever actually like realized like a video game or a TV show or really anything like had to actually change like what it was going to have in it because of like an actual event that was that had happened or was happening, and it just the fact that a video game could actually create such high stake values and such intensity that like they felt the need to change it just really kind of speaks volumes about what video games can actually do and the kind of power they have over you.
Yeah, how did it work for you, Jeff, having the game, especially the first one, but really all of them, make direct reference to real history? Like, I know in the first one you sort of watch this like video when they're talking about the entire conflict on Shadow Moses that references like the Bay of Pigs and the Cold War and a lot of like real military conflicts and like governmental policy. Like, I remember at the time that sort of threw me through a loop because I was pretty uneducated about that stuff. So I felt like, oh, maybe this is like, I'm in over my head, I'm not going to follow what's going on. But I think in the end, it actually made it cooler for me that it's sort of this revisionist history like they do in movies sometimes, where because you tie it to the real world, it like makes it feel more relatable and makes it feel more legit. So that when it takes a crazy turn later, yeah, it's still like kind of unbelievable, but it's based on something that feels like there's even a 1% chance it could sort of go that way. So it just grounds it in a certain sense.
For me, that's always been eerie and pretty creepy, actually, is how much real life stuff they tied in, which obviously, like Justin questioned earlier, that makes you question how much isn't real life almost. But especially not being a history person, this is one of those things that ironically through this game got me more interested in that type of stuff, just to understand more how it related to the game, which I think is pretty funny.
Oh, it absolutely did for me. I mean, the only reason, which is kind of maybe sad to say, but like 99% of what I know now about the Afghan Soviet War is because of the Phantom Pain. Like, not only what is revealed in the game, but just my interest in that conflict and just like the political climate in the world at that time were so much the result of me playing that game that I would just go on Wikipedia or elsewhere and just read about it because I just found it fascinating. And, I don't think any of us, for the most part, probably play games first and foremost as an insight into history, but when they can kind of provide that for you and also still be like really fun and engaging, I think that's, that's only a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But yeah, just to get back to the main series so we can kind of spotlight some of the elements or moments we like the most. Yeah, I think 1 we touched on, 5 we'll touch on in a second, Snake Eater we touched on. I think 4, I can't remember how much you saw that. I know we played a bit of it together, but 4 to me was such an incredible love letter to the series and was like so insanely cool with its fan service. Like, it felt like we know what people have liked about the series up to this point. Let's combine it all into this incredibly cutting edge, gorgeous looking game that was so much fun for me and I really enjoyed the hell out of, but just sort of lacked any of the. It didn't have that element, unique element that really set it apart the same way the top 3 in my list did. I think it was the coolest in terms of fan service, the coolest in terms of delivering just, oh my god, probably the coolest in terms of delivering the amount of, oh my god, cutscenes and like rewatchable cutscenes, but just didn't quite have that magic element the first 3 on my list did. And then, yeah, Sons of Liberty I think is a great game, and I remember loving the hell out of it when I played it. I think ultimately the protagonist change in that, and just it being on the list with such other incredible games for me, it's like almost last by default. It's not so much there's much that I hated about it. There's just, I felt like the ending, that was really one that confused the hell out of me the first time I played it in terms of the story, and just lacked some of the cohesiveness for me of the other games. But were there things you actively disliked about it, or was it more just you liked the other 2 more?
Just the other ones more. There's really nothing that I could pick apart. Even the having the whole riding thing, I thought that was cool eventually. Of course, at first you're Snake and then you're not, and it's like a huge gut punch, but at some point I fell in love with him as well, so I really didn't have a single knock on it. Just didn't have the same.
Yeah, that was risky as hell to do too. I remember like at the time thinking like, holy crap, because coming off the success of the first game, not kind of foreshadowing the fact that you wouldn't be playing a Snake for the vast majority of the game was like kind of shocking at the time. I remember I just kept thinking like, oh well, you'll this is like a dream or something. You'll go back to playing Snake soon, or this is like a little side part. And then of course, you spend the vast majority of the game as Raiden. But yeah, that was just such an awesome game, and I have such fond memories of playing that. But for some reason, it's just it's a 90. It's a 94, 95 to me on a list of a lot of like 97. So it's no hate towards that game. I think it's a fantastic game. It's just living up to some really tough company. But just in terms of some favorite moments, I feel like, we've already gone into quite a bit, and there's so much more we could go into, but just probably more so than any other series, for me, it just has so many moments that I could spotlight as individual moments that I could almost write like a thesis about just like a specific part of a game. There's certain games you could talk endlessly about, but this series has so many individual moments that I could just talk endlessly about. So maybe I'll just start with one of mine. We can just go back and forth. We can there's one I want to get your opinion on, Justin, or actually maybe I'll start with that just to get your opinion on before we get into stuff that, you have to be exposed to, but will be exposed to soon. There's a moment that I think it kind of touches on Kojima as a creator, and also just the idea of like what video games can be or should be, that I'm curious to hear your opinion on, Justin. And that's in the prequel to The Phantom Pain called Ground Zeroes, which was like a standalone, current gen game. There's a scene where a character from a previous game named Paz is like a prisoner of war, and essentially you find out through these like audio tapes that she's been like brutally sexually assaulted, and it's pretty graphic in terms of you're essentially listening to like playback of her interrogation, and it's heavily implied that she's like raped, is forced to have sex with this like underage kid, and then, spoiler alert, they essentially stick a bomb in her vagina, which detonates to set up the Phantom Pain. But I remember when this happened, this created this giant backlash about how much is too much in games. Should games be allowed to take and touch on the same level of mature content as films and television? Is this exploitation? Is this too much? And I'm curious, just from the standpoint of not even like what it meant in the game, but just on principle. Do you believe that there's really like, is there a too much when it comes to gaming or like any kind of media? Like, do you think in the right context anything's fair game, or do you think something like that would be like too much for you?
I know it's absolutely fair game. I feel like you were describing like a super intense episode of like Law and Order or something for a second, but
if that's an episode, I want to watch that one. But.
Dun dun.
No, I mean I think from an artistic standpoint, I mean definitely like not being able to be censored is always a good thing. I think when you have games like Grand Theft Auto where you can beat prostitutes up and run away from the cops and deal drugs and whatever else you can do, I don't really see why you would draw the line at sexual assault or touchy issues. I think that's actually probably a good way of dealing with the issue is getting the person to play through it, because then in a way like you're experiencing it maybe living through it and then gaining a new perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise gained. And you watch a TV show or read an article, and you might not be persuaded, but through a sort of like first person perspective, I mean, you could be persuaded otherwise, I would imagine. And so I think absolutely, like there's like no holds barred when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think the biggest reaction against it was like the fact that it's not played for laughs or anything like it sort of is. I mean, in reality, Grand Theft Auto shouldn't really be played for laughs because all that stuff's can be pretty, effed up. But for the most part, people don't approach that too seriously, at least the older games. But this was definitely played to be dramatic, to be intense, to be like really screw with you. And I just remember there being a big backlash about that. And that, I wouldn't call that one of my favorite moments, but that was definitely one of the moments where I really kind of questioned like the actual like auteur versus insane type thing, where like, is this a calculated move by him to really touch people and like get a conversation going, or is it just him trying to be as like absurd as he possibly can be? But that was just one that I thought, like, just from the standpoint of principle alone, you could definitely weigh in on. As far as favorite moments, the first one that I have jotted down here that I think is awesome is when Meryl gets shot in the original Metal Gear Solid, when you walk into the outdoor corridor and Sniper Wolf shoots her, and it's so unexpected and so dramatic and so like not predictable, but like you almost know as soon as you enter this like long corridor that's completely silent, something's gonna happen, and yet it's still like so impactful and like tense when it actually happens. Was that one you kind of enjoyed?
Absolutely, that's huge. Especially, it's one of those things that's ironic now looking at, especially with like the Game of Thrones and the talk about any main character, any character that you like is pretty much going to be either harmed or killed in some way. Especially this back then. Really, the last thing I was thinking was that this early in the game, something that drastic was going to happen to basically the second main character.
Yeah, and I didn't realize until I read online that scene was meant to be a reference to a Full Metal Jacket. That I guess the actual like cinematography of her being shot and falling over was like the same way that they show the guy Hartman's death in Full Metal Jacket, with like the ultra slow-mo fall back and the blood spatter and stuff, which is a cool reference. I don't even know if I played it now if I would have gotten that one, but it's interesting as hell that he chose to shoot it that way, because I do remember the scene well in my head, but I don't know if I would have connected the two. But that was one that I thought was so awesome. Do you have one you want to mention? Or do you want to just go back and forth?
Yeah, I have one in general that has a few points on it, and I'd also like to get Justin's opinion on it.
Yeah.
Just because it's something that comes in games, it comes in films, and for a lot of people it's super hit or miss. And that is Kojima's tendency to break the fourth wall. There's a lot of specific examples. One of the earliest ones I can remember is at some point Snake is given a disc, and he's told to check the back of the disc for Meryl's codec frequency. So of course you think like you get this disc from this character, you're going to look on the back of it, but in reality it's literally on the back of the copy of the game that you physically own. So you actually have to turn your disc over in your living room and get the frequency off the back of it. There's a few more. There's one, especially with Psycho Mantis, obviously one of the greatest things I've ever learned and ever seen, is when he starts reading the stuff off of your memory card. And at some point you actually have to switch your controller to the second port, because if you leave it in the first one, he can actually predict what you're going to do. So you actually have to switch the controller in order to beat him, which was, I thought, super cool at the time.
That was one of that still has to be the biggest mindfuck in the history of gaming. Like, even if it like pisses you off and you hated it, like you can't deny that it was just completely insane. The fact that you literally had to stand up and like rearrange your console just to beat a boss because. And what did it say? Was it like Hideo Vision or Hideo that like popped up in black when you?
Yeah, like the old input screen that you would see on like the all black screen with just like the green words in the top that might say video 1 or video 2. It actually switched to Hideo up top.
that literally scared the absolute shit out of me as a kid when that, like, I can't remember how I determined you like had to switch a controller, but that was just completely insane. I mean, yeah, as he was meant, like, is that the type of interaction with a game or a medium that you think is cool, or do you think it's kind of corny?
I know, and it's definitely super cool. I can't think of anything else that would have ever done that. And it seems a little bit like voyeuristic, like that the computer or the video game system would actually know the fact that I'm able to do that or would do that. And I can't even imagine the coding that had to go into that to even like detect like that you would be able to do that. But just the idea, I mean, it's sort of like Woody Allen-esque in like the sense of, he was a pioneer, like breaking the fourth wall, but obviously this wouldn't be in a comical sense. So yeah, I mean, at 12 or 13, that definitely would have scared the crap out of me. But at the same time, like I think it's like extremely fascinating. I mean, even listening to it now, just like having not played that far into the series,
and
like it's.
Do you plan on playing Sons of Liberty, the second one?
I have all the first three the HD remakes for PS2. So yeah,
because especially in that, at some point, and I know me and Cam have discussed this at length.
This is on my list.
Yeah. It's far from laughable. It's probably still one of the scariest things I've ever subjected myself to. But at one point, the guy that you thought was basically your commander throughout this entire game, spoiler alert, I guess, but it is what it is. You end up learning that he's basically just AI, and he basically starts to crash, and he just starts to say this absurd, off-the-wall shit to you. At some point, he starts making fun of you for playing video games. He demands that you turn the actual system off and unplug it, and all kind of just off-the-wall stuff that seems funny thinking about it, but I guarantee you when you play it, you're going to be completely horrified.
That whole sequence is so Kojima and so insane. Like, from the moment you wake up, like, completely naked and are just, like, running through that, like, darkened area that already feels, like, so surreal and bizarre. Then the first time you start taking those codec calls, and I guess at first it seems, like, kind of normal, but he just says, like, some slightly weird stuff. And then it gets completely bonkers, and he's saying, like, I remember he talks about some kind of, like, beetle or something, and, like, the blah, blah, blah beetle is, like, just reading, like, actual encyclopedia facts. But I remember we've talked endlessly about one of the times when A, he appears as a skeleton, and B, he appears with his face like an inch from the video monitor where he's like yelling, was like so out of the blue. I remember that legitimately like creeped me out because it was just like, it's one of those things just like in movies, almost like David Lynch for me, where weird can be like scarier than scary. Like it was just so odd and like so unexpected that I almost didn't know like what to. You almost feel like the game's like broken, but it's part of the game, but you almost feel like this can't be the way it's supposed to be. This is so weird. But that was like so awesome throughout. Like it's such a cool reveal because it makes you feel even more alone. Like the one of the few people you think is like an ally the whole time is actually just this malfunctioning friggin' AI. And some of the crap, at some point we'll just have to pull up a list of exactly what he can say because it's absurd. But yeah, he occasionally, I know he says stuff straight from like the first game. And then straight from like the old actual Metal Gear 2 game, and all that was just completely insane. So yeah, you've got a lot of weird stuff to look forward to, Justin.
And especially it's one of those really cool things, another Kojima thing where there's different outcomes based on what you do. So if you don't take any of his codec calls, that actually impacts the game itself, and different stuff happens, as opposed to if you answer every one. So there's different paths that get equally weird.
That's all I want.
Yeah, I always loved that about all the games is like it doesn't branch off so crazy, but it really does like make little stuff like that actually matter in the end, at least like in terms of replayability and that kind of thing. There's a lot to go back and like search for. I guess we're sort of progressing through the games in terms of moments, and I guess there still are some we could mention from 1 and 2, but just to keep it on going up through 3, I think the things that stand out the most to me in Snake Eater, there's really 3 that I'll quickly go through, and then we can talk about whichever one you think's the most interesting. But the final fight with the boss fight with the end, and just actually like the 5-minute ladder climb up from the sewers of the tunnel up to the actual like ground level. It sounds so bizarre, but never has 5 minutes of just holding up on a controller and climbing up a ladder been more exciting in a game. Like it's so cinematic and so weird in how it literally forces you to just take a break from what's been going on in the game, actually just take a deep breath and like prepare yourself for the next part in a way you can't get around. Like there's no way to skip it. You're just climbing up, but it's probably like a 70-story ladder for some reason. But it plays like in the background the Snake Eater theme behind you climbing, and it feels like the corniest action or spy movie scene ever. But for me, it works so well. Like you just get through some crazy part. I'm trying to remember who you fight before that. It might actually be the Fury down in the tunnels, but it just, like, climbing up a ladder should not be that exciting, but that is Kojima at his best, turning something so ordinary into something so weird and effective. But the boss and the end, I think, are two of the best boss fights in Metal Gear, and two of the best boss fights, in my opinion, ever. I don't know if one of those two, they're so different, but I don't know if one of those two you want to talk about more or less, but, or we can weigh a little bit in on both. Or
I do recall my first effort to persuade you to play 3 was the fight with the end. Just because right off the bat, I thought that was super, super, super cool. Probably, I mean, I guess it's an awkward thing to have really honestly a boss that really didn't mean that much in the course of the game or the story really be one of your favorite boss fights in any video game ever, considering how obviously important and epic so many boss fights normally are. Literally to the point where, and Justin, you better not do this, but the end is a super old sniper, and if you actually get to that fight and you turn the game off for a week, like real time, and you come back into the game, you just find him dead. It just is a cutscene of him actually, you sneaking up on him and him just being dead of old age. So you can either wait a week or you can just set the system a week ahead and just go right back in, and literally you'd never even fight him. You find him dead.
That's pretty cool.
I remember hearing about that and laughing so hard at how awesome that possibility is, and the fact that people like so quickly realize they could just set their systems ahead. And there's also a part earlier in the game where the Cobra unit's having a conversation where for like a split second he's wheeling through a doorway on his like wheelchair, and if you shoot him with a sniper rifle, then you can literally kill him before you even encounter him later. But without knowing you can do that ahead of time like that, I don't know if I ever would have been able to do that. But it's so cool that you can like choose to do it however you want. But yeah, the boss fight with the end is probably one of the most like expectation defying, most like brave gaming choices I think I've ever encountered, in the sense that it takes what you think of as a boss fight and completely turns it on its head to the point where it's the polar opposite of what I think of when I think of epic video game boss fights. You know, usually in a big video game boss fight, you've got intense music, health bars, you're dodging stuff, you're sweating, you know, it's super intense, it's super in your face, it's super difficult. This is literally just, you enter a gigantic area, and then it's just silent ambiance of you standing in the trees, and you're given no other instruction besides that. There's literally there's no exciting music, there's no prompt saying, go do this, go do that. You don't know where he is. You literally just are in a gigantic forested area and are trying to kill someone who's trying to kill you. And it's like so peaceful and tense simultaneously. Like, just, you can lay in wait and just try to like counter snipe him. You can try to approach him. You can, and this is where like the awesome mechanics of the Metal Gear series in general come in. Like, you can do everything from shoot his parrot that he then like comes and finds dead and like sneak up on him. Then you can throw stuff out and like hope he stumbles upon it and then like try to, it's just completely insane how the boss fight was night and day different from anything else I'd ever considered a boss fight in any game ever. And yet it was still so epic, still difficult, still interesting. Like a boss fight you'd think would be like in your face, but this was the exact opposite of in your face, but it was still so good. Like, I remember that one. I remember you explaining exactly what it was to me and me thinking, oh, that sounds kind of, you know, whatever. It's actually kind of boring. And then I got there and I'm like, this is the craziest thing ever.
I mean, this is Snake Eater in general, but also specifically that fight is on my bucket list of things to go back and actually take serious now that after having eventually gone through sniper school, there's just a whole new perspective on the entire survival camouflage concept that has become way, way, way more real for me. So now I'm actually really excited to dive back in and just see what it actually feels like to basically lay that game on top of my actual life and play the game having done a large majority of the things that you do in the game.
Oh yeah, I got to imagine even just like the basics that like I understand just from the game itself are like so important, like sight lines and not getting flanked and like high ground, and when you're playing all end up being super important. Like I just remember being scared to death if I was anywhere where he could get an easy drop on me from behind, that I was just like, crawling backwards up towards walls at all times, and you can kind of find him via like the reflection of his scope in the sun and stuff. But just such an awesome boss fight. Like, no amount of explaining exactly what it is could ever ruin it for you, because it's such an experience. And the boss is just as simple as the final boss in the game, just as simple as such an incredibly awesome visual style fight that you're fighting in that flower field with her wearing the same color vest, or like, I guess, overall like military get up, so that it was like A, hard as hell to see her, but B, just so symbolic of the, I mean, it was just so well done. Like, it felt, again, in a certain sense, with a lesser game, with a lesser designer, would have been so cheesy. But in this, it just works so well with her calling out. Just, I guess she instructed Big Boss growing up, so her calling out commands and stuff, and you ended up having to kill her, and just such an awesomely done boss fight.
And especially with that fight specifically, but also in general, throughout the series, I've always loved how, despite the fact that there's a complete arsenal, absurd amount of firearms, all kind of stuff you can do, some of the coolest moments always end up coming back to either the hand-to-hand stuff, the CQC stuff, or the sword fights, which seems super weird to have a super high-tech, super off-the-wall, amphibious, nuclear robot, essentially, and still have some of your favorite moments and some of the coolest moments just be a one-on-one sword fight, just an actual duel.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think that's such an awesome decision to make it so personal like that, because it really does make it like, it really does ground it again in the story and make the characters really confront each other, rather than just being two people with super high-powered weapons, running around launching stuff at each other. It really, especially, doing the freaking combo and like flipping her and stuff in old Metal Gear style, was just so awesome. And anything, there's a couple more minutes. The one other one that I definitely want to mention that we can talk about just in passing was the Gray Fox moment from the first game, when you first are introduced to him in the hallway when he kills the scientist, and then you have to fight him one-on-one. It's just always been one of the eeriest, most memorable, and coolest moments that I've ever come across in gaming, because it's so effective on so many levels all at once. I remember it, as soon as you enter the hallway and you see the blood, it already had me sort of on edge. Then the actual introduction of him with like his stealth technology and sword was so cool. Then being so intimidated to fight him because he literally just slaughtered an entire hallway full of people. Then the soundtrack that's like his voice like making this weird like echoing thing when you're, I mean, just on an atmosphere and tension level, it's like a 10 out of 10. And the actual boss fight with him is pretty awesome too, but the setup for that was just out of this world.
I mean, that's something that we keep going back and forth with the films and with the games, and in general, that's probably, despite the fact that it's a 30-second cutscene in a game from 20 years ago, is still one of my favorite scenes in any form of media, period, whether it be a Hollywood blockbuster or anything. It's just awesome.
Oh, I would 1,000% agree. It's so tough to be able to pull off something like that, where it's not going for just shock of violence, it's not going for just being scary. It works on so many levels, and it fits in so well with, obviously the character of Gray Fox is like a very complex one that plays a more interesting role, or more complex role later in the game. But yeah, that initial introduction just sets him up in such a insane way, where you experience so many emotions all at once, and then it just stands out so clearly in my mind still to this day. But I mean, I feel like we could go on ad infinitum about these moments. I mean, I had the Rex versus Ray fight from 4 written down here, which is just completely insane, where you go from destroying these things in previous games to all of a sudden you're in Rex at Shadow Moses blowing. I mean, you could really go moment to moment in almost any of these games and talk about how you can almost break them down as individual mini films in a sense. But we've touched on a couple of the ones I know we love. I mean, we could fill up an entire episode with just that. But just to keep it moving along and towards the finish line here, because I know we could really go on forever about it. We can just talk in passing, because I know this is a game only I've played, but and you can weigh in on this too, Justin, is were we to introduce you to this series knowing that the newest game is an open world game and not a storyline driven game specifically like the first couple, would you be drawn to one more than the other? Are you excited to play these sort of older, shorter, more point A to point B story games, or do you just think the subject matter is cool, or do you kind of just have no real basis right now for knowing, or do you kind of just going in blind to it all?
I mean, having not played the whole series, I couldn't definitively say that I would be in favor of one over the other, but I would have to imagine that. I mean, I feel like, as games evolve, as this genre evolves, I mean, I feel like at some point you kind of have to move into open world. At the same time, I mean, it sounds like based on all the moments that you've described and the crazy, like, breaking the fourth wall type thing, moments that were able to be done just in a self-contained storyline, that I can't really see the linear narrative really ruining the game by just still being in that format. I feel like if it's constantly able to like be reshaped and redone in new and innovative ways, like there's no need to necessarily expand into like this open world format. But I can see like why you would do that, and where there's some new things that you could explore that you might not have been able to in the other games. So from a creative standpoint, I mean, you could really go either way. It's just a matter of, do you want to broaden your horizons, or do you want to be forced to be creative within like the confines of like a structured environment?
Yeah, of what you saw of the Phantom Pain, did you have, coming from the standpoint of having played the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games, which are very, as we mentioned, do allow for some degree of freedom, but for the most part are pretty short and pretty, beginning, middle, end. Did you kind of have a strong opinion either way about how well it worked or didn't, or did you feel like you didn't see enough to make a fully formed opinion?
For me in general, like especially when you have like your Grand Theft Autos and that type of stuff, I've just always had this weird thing where I pretty much separate the game into 2 separate games. So I'll get into the game, I'll go through the story, I'll stick to the story as much as I can, regardless of having the open world aspect available. Just because, especially with something like this where the story is so awesome to me, I just want to keep getting the story, get the details, move the story along. So for me, I've always been the king of diving into the game, sticking to the story as much as I can until I get through it, beat the whole game, and then let the open world almost be essentially a second game, where the story is done and it's over, but now I just have hundreds of hours of missions and all kind of weird shit to do on the side.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect way to approach it, or at least like that's the kind of way I try to approach it, and I think works so well is when a game can work on 2 levels as an actual story-driven game and then separate side stuff to do to even fill it out even more. It's really the best of both worlds, and I think on the whole, obviously I mentioned the Phantom Pain is my second favorite Metal Gear Solid game, so obviously I liked it quite a bit, but yeah, that was both the biggest shortcoming and the coolest thing about it to me was I was so apprehensive when I heard about the open world part of it, because it is a game that I like the story element of so much in the first 4 Metal Gear Solid games, and couldn't really imagine a game where you can go extended periods of time without advancing the story at all. But overall, the cool factor and the amount of detail and just complete insane quantity and quality of stuff that was put into the Phantom Pain ultimately made up, that ground for me. But it was disappointing that I feel like the biggest shortcoming of the game was the fact that its story didn't quite live up to the first 4. And it wasn't because the story itself wasn't worth it. The story itself I actually thought was pretty awesome. There was a lot of stuff in it story-wise that I thought was great. The whole thing of filling in kind of the missing pieces with Big Boss, who, spoiler alert, isn't actually Big Boss in the game. All the stuff with just rebuilding Mother Base and everything that was going on back then was so cool, and I wanted to learn so much more about it all, but the game kind of ends on so many cliffhangers and leaves so much out because so much time and effort was put into creating the world as a whole and putting so much content in that I feel like they just didn't devote the amount of time and thought they should have to make it live up to the Metal Gear Solid name in terms of the story. But from the standpoint of just amount of content and cool stuff you can do, base building, the amount of items, the graphics, the freedom, just completely, and like I put probably 150 to 200 hours into that game, and I did 100% it and platinum it, but I really only scratched the surface of some of the stuff you can do. I mean, there was so much more stuff online and beyond that you could get into, but it offered so much bang for its buck, or bang for the buck for me, but yeah, it didn't quite measure up to some of the fun story memories we have of the other games.
I do have a quick question for you, having played through that. How much of that do you think came from the fact that if you look at the series chronologically, it's actually like super wacky? Like obviously the Metal Gear Solid being the first game that we played, I guess comes in at like number 8 in the actual timeline of the actual chronological timeline.
Yeah.
With Snake Eater, I guess, being the first, and then 4 being the last. Especially story-wise, since he already had so much tied up before and after, there really only so much, in my opinion, that he really could have done, considering basically the tracks are already laid. You're just kind of connecting the dots at this point. You think that hurt his ability to be himself and be as creative as he would have liked? Like if you say somebody just going from start to finish and it's just constantly building and eventually reaching this point where...
I think it did, and I think that's a great question, and I think that made it so much more interesting to me while playing, but it made the ending more disappointing, is because there's so much in the game that you're led to believe all along is a reference to later games and like, you know, Easter eggs and characters that you expect are people later in the series, etc., that are eventually confirmed, but because their futures are already written in the later games, you already know what happens with them. You know they don't die, you know, so you kind of aren't really on edge about what happens with them. For instance, you know, there's a character in the game that ends up being Liquid Snake as a kid that you encounter, and it was like cool as hell to see where he came from and him when he's young and him operating, but he kind of just disappears and goes off, and you learn that he, you know, goes off and does everything he does leading up to Metal Gear Solid. But like, I wanted to know more about what happened with him then, but they kind of just defaulted to, oh well, we already know his future. This is just us introducing him. Blah blah blah. Same thing with Psycho Mantis. There's a kid that's introduced that you later find out is Psycho Mantis, who's like incredibly cool and creepy in the game. But again, they just kind of leave that open ended and say, you know, this is where he got his start. He, you know, you find out more in later games, but I wanted that to be more. I did feel like his hands were tied by what was already written, and I would have liked it more if we would have been able to sort of go a bit more off the rails with some of that stuff, because so much was already, so many of the tracks that you said were already laid that they were sort of, you know, there's some off the wall and really cool stuff in it still, but there is some stuff that they kind of copped out on because they already had the ending written in another way, so they kind of just left it completely like just kind of drops off dead and just picks up in the later games.
And that's something, and you can speak to this if you think it'd be beneficial for him the first time, but on my bucket list of video game activities, at some point I'm going to go back through and actually play the game chronologically. So starting at 3, ending with 4, and just having everything in between. So I don't know if, especially before you even dive in, you can speak to this, Cam, if that's something that you might find more interesting, is as opposed to starting at number 8 in the series, if you actually start chronologically, whenever, is Snake Eater the 60s?
Yes, I believe it's mid-60s.
So now that all the games are out, you have the option of starting where it should start in time, and then just following it chronologically up to the conclusion, which, like Cam was saying, it might help the story in general if you're just learning as you go.
Yeah, I don't think there's a wrong way to do it. I think both those ways could be so cool, because on the one hand, I feel like learning about Big Boss through the lens of Solid Snake makes him like so legendary that when you finally play as him, it's so cool. But then in another sense, it would make hearing all the history of Big Boss kind of cooler if you started with those games and then played them chronologically, because when you eventually get to Solid, etc., you were the one that already experienced doing all that, so you like know what they're referencing when they talk about, you know, Operation Snake Eater and, you know, Les Enfants Terribles, which is, you know, the cloning of Solid and Liquid. And, you know, I actually think that's a great, it's almost like the way people look at Star Wars now. There's like the actual 1 through will eventually be 9, or some people say start with the prequels and go chronologically. Some people say start with the original trilogy. I think it's all valid. It's however you think you'll enjoy it the most. But yeah, I'd be, if you do play it in a different order, I'd like to hear your opinion, Justin, because I think that would have influenced the way I understood the story big time. Because the story does get absurd. Like, I'm a huge fan of the series, and we're here. We've almost gotten in an hour and a half of conversation, which shows how intensive this series is. And we really, you know, we could talk this long about it, and I still don't understand some of the crazy twists and turns in the games. But yeah, it just I'll be really. I think your first playthrough of the games is going to be really fascinating, Justin. Yeah, the last bullet point. Well, first of all, I'm kind of disturbed that we've talked for an hour and a half about Metal Gear and haven't even said the name Revolver Ocelot.
That's insane.
Yeah, the last bullet point I had written down here was just, and maybe you can see, it'll be interesting, Justin, if we say these words. I was going to say, kind of trying to sum up in a succinct way, if you had to say what makes Metal Gear, just putting it as simply as you can, what words come to mind. You can see if any of these words would have come to mind just from watching the early parts, and B, when you eventually play it, if this is your same opinion. But some of the things I jotted down just for what makes it what it is things like homage, how heavy it is on homage to other stuff, melodrama, how there's not much subtlety in the games. Big dramatic moments are incredibly dramatic and intense. Characters are quite over the top for the most part, which I know a lot of people will get turned off by that, but it's kind of it's the type of thing you either love it or hate it. Like you if you like Metal Gear, you have to accept that as part of the appeal. If you want, Oscar-winning voice acting and like acting in general, it might not be the series for you because it's really grounded in like much more throwbacky retro type stuff, but absolutely melodrama.
Does Kiefer have an Oscar?
That was actually he does not, but yeah, I think they tried to bring in a certain grittiness to the Phantom Pain in casting him, and for the most part, I think he was really good in it. But yeah, that's actually a funny point because I think he made a conscious shift in that direction with the Phantom Pain. I ultimately don't think it mattered all that much. But what else did I jot down here? Just cool. Like, I don't think any series, like in all seriousness, like, and you can tell me if you feel the same, but like, it's just a series that Kojima just has a way to combine bizarre aspects and bizarre ideas in such a manner that he comes up with just some of the most downright damn like cool set pieces, characters, and like moments, period. Like, he combines things that shouldn't work when they're combined, but he does it in such a manner that it's just bad, like just flat out badass. Like, it would be cheesy and so weird or uninteresting in someone else's hands, but the fights, the technology, the outfits, the weapons, I mean, just everything is just, I mean, I don't think I could use a single word to describe. In describing the series, I think cool would be the word that would come up the most if I was saying this moment's cool, this character's cool, this weapon's cool. I mean, it's one of the first things I think of when I think of the game. Like,
yep, and that goes to one of my points. Is throughout the essence for me had a lot to do with the naming conventions. Between the different units with your Dead Cell, your Foxhound, and then just a lot of the bosses like the End, the Fury, Revolver Ocelot. For me, it just goes back to the whole cool thing. Like, literally, if I was asked to come up with super badass names for secret military organizations, they're not going to be as cool as Dead Cell.
and I think that also speaks to like what I think it's a perfect example. Like, if you told me some of those names with like a straight face just in conversation, I'd say that's the dumbest thing I've ever, like, it's so bizarre. But in the context of the game, like, it becomes so cool when you actually see the characters themselves and like, some of the like Decoy Octopus and like Revolver Ocelot. Even like the first time I heard those actual names, I'm like, it's a strange choice of things to put together. But of course now they're like legendary in the realm of gaming and characters. So it's just flat out cool. Like, there's no other way to put it. I also jotted down complicated because I think he has a knack for really liking twisting, turning, really absurdly. He doesn't like straightforward storytelling. He likes storytelling that gets very convoluted, and everyone's a double, triple, quadruple agent, and everyone is working for someone else, and it references things from earlier and then flashes forward, and he does not like conventional storytelling. He really likes really tightly wound, really intense ways of trying to communicate things, and then also just innovative and shocking. I mean, he likes big moments that are really like water cooler type. Like, in a movie, they're really big, like Shyamalan twists, but his games have them like every hour, basically. And as far as innovative goes, I cannot think of a game that lends itself more on YouTube, etc., to people just trying wacky out there shit that you can actually do in the game. I mean, Snake Eater with just about every boss can be beaten through like 10 different means. You get weird items you can throw at people. You get, you can throw animals at people, you can hide in boxes, you can throw poison fruit, you can hold people up. I mean, it's literally not A for punch, B for shoot, C for kick. It's like the amount of ways you can incapacitate people, beat bosses, and travel through the world. It's not limitless, but it almost feels limitless. Like you can do damn near anything you want and progress. And that just, I mean, it's always been on the cutting edge.
And I'll go on the flip side of that coin, and this is something that you'll see, especially playing this game now, given the world that we live in current events. Actually, one of the moments I had for one of my favorite is at the end of Sons of Liberty. And at the time, it seemed off the wall and really weird, but also made me stop and think. I don't know the exact quote, but essentially Emma says something about the Patriots being able to digitally control all of the information coming in, which at the time just seemed like a horrifying concept, that there was just a group of people or a government that's going to take in all the information and then just keep stuff from us, which then, especially at that age, seemed scary but still off the wall. And now looking back, given that it's been 20 years pretty much with all the Snowden stuff and the North Korea and the China stuff, it's just insane how that actually came to be like in existence right now. So I think that's going to give you a whole different perspective on the entire series, and the story is just knowing how much of it now is real life.
Yeah, I mean, I think first words for me, if I were to pick some words based on everything I know up to this point, I think I would have gone with like action hero noir propaganda. I feel like, looking at like Solid Snake, I mean, it just kind of looks like a G.I. Joe type character, but like more modernized, and then just noir in the sense of like just being investigative, being able to like search rooms and look for clues and figure out like the best way of like being stealthy and accomplishing your missions and things like that. And then just propaganda, I just feel like kind of sensationalizing some like kind of like current events that are kind of more subtle, or maybe not even current events, but like just like historical events in general. I feel like, like I said, like I referenced that he kind of looks like a G.I. Joe type character, and just being kind of like, war is cool, like the army's cool, like, be a Navy SEAL or be like an army guy and just like destroy the world.
What I think you'll like so much about the games is I actually think the games are they actually make military tech and military operations pretty cool looking, but for the most part, the games have a very anti-war message, or really make the idea of like the average civilian or like average citizen caught up in war like a big part of the theme of the overall games, which I think is cool because it's like to make something attractive but also have a real message is like a really hard thing to pull off. Usually it's one way or the other, but I think you'll find that as you play it. Yeah, and just as far as innovative goes, I can't really think of another series that has like more different narrative framing techniques. Like the first one I wrote down was like the use of the codec is just such a cool thing, where rather than the traditional cutscene, which it has a lot, and the cutscenes themselves are like little works of art, but the codec was just such a cool thing. I hadn't seen in another game before, but B, just made for some awesome moments, because obviously there was some codec parts that were like part of the actual story. Then there was just codec calls you could make on your own that either provided you information, or you got more backstory, or you actually used it to like save, etc. But just the framing of using the codec made it feel, it tied into the story so well. It made you feel more alone. It like gave you this thing where you could find out more about these characters if you wanted, but you didn't have to. The use of other framing stuff like the crazy twists and the protagonist split from Snake to Raiden in 2. It's just a game that you never get a traditional game starts, stays the same throughout, and ends. Like every game has some way of just turning the idea of gaming on its head and giving you just a brand new experience that I'm like so excited to get started playing a new one, which, I'm going to tear up a little bit talking about the fact that there probably won't be another Kojima Metal Gear game ever again, but I was always so excited to play him because I just knew it was going to be something completely different from anything else I'd ever done before. It wasn't just going to be an improved version of the previous one. It was going to be something completely new and off the wall. So, yeah, I mean, I couldn't actually stop us any sooner because I felt like everything we were saying was so valid, and I wanted to hear so much what you guys were saying. But yeah, this is far and away our longest episode, which I like because, as we mentioned at the get-go, it's just a long series with a ton of content. I mean, there's so much, like in our Final Fantasy episode, that we could, talk for another hour about easily, but, at a certain point, you just got to acknowledge that we can't capture everything that Metal Gear has to offer in any length podcast. So anything else you guys want to kind of just say about your anticipation of the series or your enjoyment of the series that might kind of sum up your feelings?
I did learn one quick little fact. Obviously, throughout the game, as you'll hear a bunch, for us, I guess it's the la li li lo, which always obviously gibberish, weird code name for the Patriots. But something really cool that I learned recently was that in Japanese, there is no L in their alphabet, period. So literally there is no way for Japanese people to say those actual words without the L, and they can't write it either. So it's a really cool concept of this ghost organization that literally in Japanese they can't talk about or write about if they wanted, just because the L literally doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's incredibly cool. It's like this intangible concept that would really no, because I always wondered what that stemmed from. Like, it was just such an interesting audio cue to like mean this creepy organization, but I always wondered if it actually meant like came from anything that made sense, and that makes perfect sense because it literally like is an embodiment of what that organization is in the games. But you, maybe just a couple words, Justin, about, has this episode changed your anticipation at all? Are you planning, do you have any takeaways from all this, or you kind of just want to go in full steam ahead?
I mean, my takeaway is that it sounds like it's probably the most insane gaming series of all time, and just the fact.
Yeah, no big deal. Just the most insane game.
I mean, just so innovative with. Yeah, I mean, the fact that they put so much thought and like nuance into a video game, just incredibly mind blowing. I don't know anything else that's even come close to approaching that level of subtlety and detail and everything else. That
Nothing ever has.
Yeah, I'd call it the most subtlety-less game ever made. Like, nothing subtle in it, but there's so much subtext and so much nuance still, if that makes any sense, that it's like so on the surface, and yet there's a million things underneath it, which is like such a cool aspect of the series. So yeah, I mean, obviously, as we often talk about, and I hope this is another good example of gaming both in the past and the present sort of reaching into the boundaries of other media forms and showing that at their best, games can be as thought-provoking, interesting, moving, memorable as other art forms. They aren't always, but they can be. And if you want to find some that are, I think the Metal Gear series is a great place to look. So we've already kept you long enough. Hopefully you enjoyed us waxing poetic about such an awesome series. I can't really thank you enough, Jeff. I mean, like I said, it's just the kind of thing where it isn't, you feel like when you're remembering these moments, it doesn't feel right to sort of be talking about them alone, because even though we experience a lot of these moments on our own, like we obviously played some of these games together, a lot of these moments we played, or especially for the first time, separately, but that memory is like still so relatable that you almost feel like you could have been playing it with the person, because even if your interpretation is different, just that initial shock and awe and excitement is just so relatable. So like it wouldn't have been the same talking about the series without you. So thank you for coming on, and I think you were the absolutely perfect person to be discussing this with.
And make the world's longest episode. Which could be twice as long if we could just sit here. I could keep going.
Yeah, I mean, that if the viewers demand it, or if we just choose to say F you and do it, there might be a part 2. But thank you guys so much. Before we get out of here, this has been a Metal Gear episode. I want to tell you real quickly where you can find us online. I know we've been sort of sporadic with our episodes, but hopefully this episode is proof that we still do like doing this. We have stuff we want to talk about, a lot of, useless or not so useless information that we're willing to throw down your ear holes if you're so willing to accept it. So Justin, you want to mention the first couple places, the first 2 you can find us online?
Certainly. There's of course our website, which is thelimitbreakers.libsyn.com. And then you can always email us at thelimitbreakerspod@gmail.com. Send us any questions. If you're still listening, we appreciate you listening. If you skip to the end, thank you for skipping to the end so you know where you can find us.
Yeah, you can't fast forward this podcast. We're not like the end. You can't skip to the end of this and we'll all
It's
be
just like
dead.
a Kojima twist where like you have to like play through the whole thing to actually like get the full content. And
Yeah.
you can't,
I'm
like
gonna
plugging the controller into port 2 kind of.
I'm gonna like tonight late just splice in like Fight Club style a couple 2-second clips of me saying weird shit like Roy Campbell, and then if you like if you play it, you'll get subliminal messages of me talking about the tsetse fly or whatever he was talking about. But no, we can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/thelimitbreakerspod and on Twitter at twitter.com/limitbreakerpod. So as always, guys, thank you so much for listening. I've had a blast. We're gonna drink some more scotch, beer, or whatever Snake would drink. Have a good time. Enjoy our weekend. Hopefully you will too. This has been episode 10 of the Limit Breakers podcast. For our good friend Jeff, for Justin, and for myself, Cameron, this has been episode 10. Thanks, you guys.